you're live.
Welcome, everyone. Good evening. My name is David Reif. I'm the director of the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Iowa. On behalf of Michael Cowan, the chair of the Department of Cinema Arts, and Kimbrough McLeod, the chair of the Department of Communication Studies, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Media Work, Social Justice in Iowa, an alumni panel. Our three departments are sponsoring this event as part of the CLAS year-long program Pursuing Racial Justice at the University of Iowa. Allow me to introduce the two facilitators for this event, Tessa Adams and Nichole Shaw. Tessa is a doctoral candidate in the UI's Mass Communication PhD program. Her research focuses on race and representation in film and television. Before coming to the University of Iowa, Tessa worked as a videographer, a video editor, a video production editor, a video production instructor, and a director. She served as an adjunct faculty member at Walsh University, Kent State University, and her two-time alma mater, the University of Akron. Nicole is a graduating senior studying journalism and English at the University of Iowa. She's reported for the Daily Iowan as a columnist and occasional feature reporter, and currently serves as chairman of its SPI board. She also works as the lead peer mentor for the SJMC at the University of Iowa. She's the editor of Off Kilter Media, a Chicago content creation agency rooted in inclusive storytelling, and a reporter for the New York Times Student Journalism Institute. In all of these positions, her mission has been to tell the stories of voices that often go unheard or ignored. I want to thank the Department of Communication Studies and Cinema Arts for collaborating with us on this event. I also want to thank Nick Arp, the Director of Strategic Communication in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, for helping us to publicize the event and to put on the event. I want to thank our panelists for their participation, and Tessa and Nicole for serving as our facilitators. With that, let me turn it over to Nicole. Nicole?
Thank you, Dr. Reif. I really appreciate that intro, and thank you to all the panelists for being here with us today. Now, you all have busy schedules, and so we're really appreciative of you all lending your voice in this space. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists, and when I introduce you all, please state your graduation year from Iowa and your current job title. So first, we have Ryan Ford.
Wow, I didn't know the first question was going to make me feel old. I graduated from the University of Iowa in the year 2000, Y2K. And I'm currently the president and chief creative officer of a cultural advertising and marketing agency in Los Angeles called Cashmere.
Thank you, Ryan. Really appreciate that. And thank you for being here. Next up, we have Dana Roberson.
All right, Ryan, now you're making me feel really old. I am a graduate 1987, and I'm current executive producer of PBS NewsHour Weekend, based here in New York City. Nice to be here.
Nice to have you here, Dana. Thank you so much. Next, we have Isaiah Scales.
Hey, everybody. Communications 2004, and I am in Los Angeles with Walt Disney, and I actually manage their creative services team.
Very exciting. Thank you, Isaiah. And last but definitely not least, we have Risa Tanania.
That was very close. That was very close. That was better than most. It's Risa and Tanania. The last name is like Mamma Mia.
Very sorry. Apologize.
Don't apologize. I get much worse all the time. It's a hunk of Italian. I'm first generation. Along with Ryan, I graduated my BA at University of Iowa in 2000, and I did my master's of art also at the University of Iowa in 2002. Nice to be here. Yeah. Oh, I forgot what I do. Sorry. I am the co-owner of a boutique casting house in New York City called the House That Casting Built. We cast unscripted, large-scaled unscripted television, and our focus and philosophy and mantra is diversity and inclusion and representation. There you go.
Thank you, Risa.
Yeah.
And thank you for the correction on your last name. I also get my first name mispronounced all the time, so I appreciate it. And again, thank you all for being here and sparing time and also lending your voice to this very important conversation. And so as we move throughout this conversation, I want to let the audience know that you can please submit any question that you'd like to ask into the Q&A function. And both Tess and I will be looking at those as we move throughout the conversation. With that being said, Tess and I also had the privilege to pre-interview the panelists about their various experiences. And so I'd like to begin with a focus on the actual experience of these panelists. And so Ryan, I'm gonna go to you first. I know in our conversation, I was particularly struck by the way that you focused on establishing your voice early on in your career as it relates to culture particularly. And so if you could tell everyone how you managed to do that and why it was so important to you, that would be really, really great. I'm particularly interested in how your voice shows up in your experience and what it's done for you in the industry.
Yeah, I think, you know, I'm from Iowa. I'm from Des Moines, Iowa. And being a person of color in Iowa is a very unique experience, right? You know, whether it's now or, you know, in, you know, the 80s or 90s. And both of my parents are not from Iowa. My father's from Washington, D.C. My mother's from Minnesota. They actually met at Drake University. And I was just always was very intentional about carving out cultural space in my life early on. I was, you know, was a DJ on a community-based radio station in Des Moines, KUCB. Even when I got to University of Iowa, I just was very intentional about carving out these cultural spaces for me. My thing was hip hop, right? And it still is. And I always like had to carve out space to really be intentional and focus on that. So at University of Iowa, you know, I was on KRUI, you know, as a DJ. I, you know, found local hip hop artists there in, you know, Iowa City or Cedar Rapids to align with. I'd go hang out at a record store, if we remember what those are, right? Record CD store. I'd go hang out there and just make sure that I had intentional time to really cultivate my cultural voice, right? And throughout my schooling, I would do the same, whether it was, I went to Roosevelt High School in Des Moines, Iowa, writing for the newspaper about issues that were pertaining to me or to not just culture, but the culture, as we call it now, right? And I continued to do that at University of Iowa with, you know, Dr. Vernice Berry, you know, writing, cultivating a curriculum for myself, which wasn't necessarily on the books. I have a journalism degree from University of Iowa, but, you know, taking classes here and there, writing for NURU, like being a part of the National Association of Black Journalists, building the National Association of Black Journalists Iowa website at the time. These were very intentional things that were all over and above like my schooling, right? And I always felt the need to do that. And honestly, I wasn't doing it in a strategic fashion. I was just doing it because it was like calling me, right? And I wanted to allow that part of me to blossom as well.
Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, I really, really appreciate that. I'm also a part of NABJ and I participate as a co-editor of NUI right now. So I really appreciate your insight about how you really crafted that space for you here at Iowa. And just to follow up really, really quick, if you can, also, like, how do you, you know, carry that that purpose in crafting a space for the culture and for your voice to be very unapologetic and unfiltered in your current job now at Cashmere Agency?
Yeah, I've always felt blessed and honored and fortunate to be able to be in rooms or in environments that a lot of my peers growing up were not able to be in. And that included the University of Iowa, it included just going to college, right? And I always felt blessed and fortunate and responsible if I'm going to be in these places. And these days it might be a corporate boardroom for Disney or what's up, Isaiah? See you. Or BMW or something like that. And I have to represent you know, my community and my friends and family from a global perspective who might not ever have the opportunity to be in one of those, be in some of those environments, right? And, you know, on the flip side, you know, for years I was a hip hop journalist and I would go interview, you know, Snoop Dogg or Puffy or Suge Knight or somebody. And I felt the responsibility, like if I have the opportunity to talk to these guys about what drives them, what inspires them, like I felt the responsibility to connect that back to people that are never going to have the opportunity to be in those rooms, right? So I bring that with me in all the work that we do, whether it's a commercial for Google with Donald Glover, whether it is, you know, a Instagram post for, you know, the next episode of Dave on FX or something like that. It has to resonate culturally for all the people that don't have the opportunity to, you know, create content or connect content back to the community.
Okay, so I want to go ahead and ask Isaiah a question. So when we spoke, we talked a lot about networking, and we talked a lot about opportunity that was provided to you by the University of Iowa when you were there. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that looked for you as a Black man and how that experience translated to your career now.
Probably the you know, number one thing I talk to when I talk with students when I'm back there, or anybody really, because it completely changed my life. Probably the biggest things I learned at Iowa was not only how to recognize opportunity, but making sure you take full advantage of those opportunities. It's like for coming up this week, actually, is the first time I ever have a chance to do a dual session with my mentor, Tom Tyre, who came back to Iowa, actually graduated Iowa, and he was back in my class, and he was senior vice president of Fox Entertainment at that time. And when you're young, especially when you haven't been exposed to the business, you don't really know a lot of things, and you don't often know what you're missing out on. So I almost missed my big break because I was so focused on just getting to the next class because I had a test in it. And something, just a light bulb went off on me. And I said, man, it's not that often that a senior vice president of a company like Fox comes into your classroom in Iowa City, Iowa. So I dropped everything. I just left my class and ran back to the classroom just to talk to him. And I was like, TV and film is what I want to do. And that's how he and I connected. And he gave me his card, just said, stay in contact with me. And that's how my career actually started with Fox, just from that one conversation in a classroom in Iowa City. So every single opportunity that I've ever had, I'm always thinking about recognizing opportunity and make sure you make the most of it. So it's not always the easiest thing to find these opportunities, because every other student that was in that classroom with me had the same opportunity as me. And I find out years later, I was still the only one to actually make that connection with them and say, hey, this is what I'm interested in doing. And I don't know what everybody else is doing, but I know what I'm doing. So it's like, you got to like understand, like, even if it's not what everybody else is doing, make sure if you see an opportunity, make sure you take it. When I'm back on campus, I love, because I tell the story and I see it resonating with students. I get lines of people all just waiting after class to take the moment to talk to me, because I'm like, I hope you pick up on that's how my life in Los Angeles started, because of that one moment. So when I see people, it makes me happy to see that, hey, they recognize what I was talking about to begin with. And you know, I got to shout out Iowa football player Desmond King. Actually, he was back in the class when I was back visiting one time, and I could tell his boy wanted to leave. His boy wanted to leave after class. He's like, man, let's go. And Desmond already had his future of the NFL already waiting for him. You know, he was like ready to go to the NFL, but I kept seeing Desmond out of the corner of my eye because he was back there a little bit. He's like, no, hold on. And the whole time I kept thinking, man, I hope he stays around long enough. And he got up to the front to me. We just had a quick conversation. But what it recognized, it told me, I said, man, there's a player with millions of dollars in his face, and he still recognizes the opportunity to take this moment just to talk to him. And he talked to me a little bit about his idea of post play and maybe doing some color commentating when he was done. And that to me was like a real eye opener. I said, man, a lot of people, they just don't get it, or they're past that. You know what I said? So I give him a lot of credit in that, because I said, man, that's what it's really about. And all through your career, you're going to have those moments where you just find somebody who becomes that one chance, takes that one chance on you. And that's what my career was. And so, yeah, when you talk about the only other thing I would say, not the only thing, but another thing from Iowa City goes back to what Ryan said. It's the unique opportunity that you have being a person of color in the state of Iowa. It literally prepared me for corporate America. I really never even talked about it until, honestly, this past year. But to me, if I look back at my career, what I was able to do was always be comfortable being uncomfortable. And I could be in an environment where nobody else is like me, and I can still navigate the room just like that with you. And that's what you got to be, because the real world is, they may not be just like you, but you have to be able to find a way to bridge that gap with people. You got to be able to be that mover, that shaker, someone that makes those kind of connections and moves, even if it's in uncharted territories for you. And that's probably one of the things that's led to a lot of successes in my career.
Wow, thank you so much for that response. I really love that you talk about networking, you talk about, bridging the gap and putting yourself out there. I think that's something that a lot of students, need to hear.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can say as a student, that definitely is, something that I'm very clued into right now, especially in fostering those connections and uplifting the voices of people who look like me and creating those shared spaces. It's something that I know, Dana, you and I talked about in our discussion, especially being very intentional about creating those spaces and being very intentional about the work you do. So I would love to hear about, your experience, both from your, just growing up, your time in Iowa, but also beyond, about how you create those spaces and how you stay really rooted in purpose.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Flint, Michigan. And so I, didn't, I was around a pretty diverse group of people. Ryan, interestingly enough, my parents met at Drake University. My mother's from Des Moines. My father was from East Chicago, Indiana, and they met there and sort of had that connection. My father actually went to the University of Iowa, which sort of drew me there, coming from Flint, where, most of my peer groups were, Black and brown kids, right? That's what I sort of grew up around. Iowa, even though my mother had grown up there and I had gone to Des Moines and hung out and visited her family, was a little bit of a culture shock, to be honest, when I got to the university. I mean, Ryan, I think you talked about NABJ. I'm trying to remember when I was in journalism school, I feel like we were trying to get an NABJ chapter going, and people were like, what who's going to be a part of it, like me and like me, what I mean? So it was a real sort of wake up call a little bit in terms of that adjustment. But part of the reason I got into journalism to begin with was because growing up in Flint, I thought there were a lot of sort of I don't want to say fake news, that's sort of the catchword of this day, but I felt like there were sort of a lot of stories that weren't centered around the people that I grew up with. And then coming to Iowa, certainly there weren't a lot of stories centered around the people that I grew up with and sort of what I was used to growing up. And it just sort of was a driver for me to figure out a way to navigate a different world, which is very important because most newsrooms don't have a lot of people of color in them. So it really prepared me for being the only in a lot of positions as I sort of made my career moves moving up. It didn't surprise me that I was the only Black person in the room, or the only brown person in the room, or the only person that actually spoke up and said, I don't know if we want to use that language when reporting this story. It really kind of prepared me for that in a lot of ways. And so, I think, I can go on and on about how it also gave me a lot of doubts. And it also, I had a lot of sort of insecurities about, am I doing the right thing? Can I say this? Am I going to be called out because I'm not sort of walking that line that I think people expect me to walk? Sort of, you're coming from Iowa and, you've been around a lot of white people and you kind of go along and get along sometimes. And you have to sort of muster up over time that confidence, I think, to speak your truth. And what's interesting for me is I found after a long time at CBS, in some really high profile shows, I didn't really start to come into my own until I left kind of that infrastructure that I think I was sort of accustomed to, and really started thinking about why I got into journalism in the first place, and sort of those voices that I wanted to elevate that were much more like mine. And now I'm fortunate enough to be in a position where I can really make a lot of decisions. I make the decisions about the kind of the people, the voices that I want to tell stories. You know, I can very clearly say, okay, we're going to do a story this weekend about what's going on in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. We've already been covering the Chauvin trial, but now we've got a whole other situation here. I know very specifically what kind of voice I want to have this conversation with this weekend. And it's nice sort of being in a position where I can say, there's an African-American reporter we've gone to at Minnesota Public Radio who's been great, you know, and that's the voice I want to hear. And so I think for young people coming up, I think there's a lot of pressure to go along and get along, and a little bit of maybe concerns about if you'll continue to have a job. You know, if you do speak out and you do try to sort of walk outside the box a little bit. But I also think we're now in a time where everyone wants those voices, and they're looking for people that can guide them and help find those voices. And so I think I've totally gone off offline a little bit. I apologize for that. But I just think that it's important to center your voice and the people that you want. I mean, we all want to have these conversations. We all want to have these difficult conversations about race in this country. Well, you have to bring the right people into those conversations, you know, and the right voices, and be in the position where you can make the call and say, no, we're not going to have this person. We're going to bring this person in. So I don't know if I answered that entirely, but you know, hopefully that got us kind of there.
No, yeah, you absolutely did, Dana. Thank you so much. And I am so happy to see as well that like that persistence to have your voice heard, like paid off in the role you are now, to where you are in a position behind the scenes to foster that equitable change. So I really, really appreciate that insight, and I'll let Tessa take it from here.
Thank you, Nicole. Risa, so in our conversation together, we talked about you being the co-founder of The House That Casting Built. And, you know, through this and through your role as casting director, you build spaces for traditionally marginalized groups. So can you tell us a little bit about, you know, what your experience has been like doing those things?
That's a broad one. I'm gonna do my best. The first thing I'm gonna say is like, what a beautiful position to be in right now next to y'all. So thank you. I'm honored to be here. And I love Iowa. I love Iowa. So anytime I can be a part of it in any way. So when I completed my work at the University of Iowa, and I come from here, so like talk about a culture shock. I'd never seen so many white people in my entire life. It was stunning to me. And I had joked with Tessa, which is the truth. I'd also never seen that many tall people in my life because everyone was like a corn stalk. And here everybody was like short. We were all, you know, short peeps. So that was the thing. Being at Iowa was extremely humbling. And I was an 80s raised kid. So I just grew up in front of the TV with like box cereal, and that's what I did. And when I was in Iowa and started making sort of radical queer art, I had a really hard time merging those two things, right? My love of pop culture and my politics. Those things didn't mesh. It was completely ironic. And my artist colleagues there were all trying to make really independent films, and there was like a radical badassness, right? That I loved and respected and appreciated. And at the same time, I felt like that wasn't how to reach the mass. So I came back to New York and started working in television. And it was at the start of, it was like the height of reality. Actually, it wasn't the height. It was the beginning of reality, right? Reality was like started with Survivor and stuff. It was like 99, 2000. So as soon as I came back here, I found the way to have my politics and my passion connect, and that was through reality television. It was the only space that we didn't need super high execs to approve. There were no shows with leads of color anywhere at that time. Scandal hadn't happened yet, and even when Scandal happened, that was like one. So unscripted TV became this free space where you could put queer people and brown people and Black people all over the place, and people weren't saying no as much, right? I still had to stack that deck a little bit. But I just became a professional ally, and that was it. I just decided, you know what? If I can get on the casting side of things and I could have people represented, at least they're seeing themselves on screen, and that's better than nothing. So I had to battle within my own. First of all, I'm just an ally, right? I'm queer, but I'm an ally. So I had to battle with my own privilege and figure out where I'm doing good, for the communities that I'm trying to represent, if I'm representing them appropriately, what's appropriate, what's not, right? This is at the time where it's like Flava Flav was the only big show on VH1. And I remember, I think I had an opportunity to work on it. And I remember wondering, is this what I want? Is this what my allyship should lend itself to? Or can it be bigger? And if it can be bigger, how do I make it that? So after working in freelance for probably 8 years, every show under the sun that was like unscripted, a ton of VH1 shows, Bravo shows. I think my last Bravo show before I created my own company was small. It was called Chef Roble & Co. An amazing African-American chef who works a lot with the hip hop community, actually. Then I decided, you know what? I'm going to create my own and just have diversity and inclusion and representation, both in front of the camera, back of the camera, in the casting zone, all of that. I'm going to have that be the focus of my company. And that way, everyone who's working alongside me and underneath me and my business partner are doing it with a very specific angle. And in the very beginning, in May, my company turns 10. Yay. In the beginning, we had to do a lot of stacking the deck. That's it. I mean, I just had to like hide some peeps. That's what it was. It was like, I may have 20 size 2 gorgeous, white chicks, but like, that don't mean I'm going to put them all up. I'm not, because there are too many other faces that aren't going to be chosen. If the people are choosing I know they're going to go right there. So that's what I did in the beginning. And then eventually, and we're not anywhere near where we need to be, but now I don't have to stack the deck anymore. Now people are coming to my company because we're known for our diversity and inclusion. So now Netflix is coming straight to me saying, we want to do this new show about blah. And we need to make sure that you're doing it right. So now, it's been a beautiful journey to be able to see. Again, we're nowhere where we need to be, but it's definitely getting better. And my entire company just makes sure that we are always seeing a perspective that is not just minority, right? It's minority on top of minority on top of minority on top of minority. There's lots of colors in every rainbow. So even the last dating show I did, which was called Dating Around on Netflix, which was super documentary vibe, very realistic. One episode was a 70-year-old white man going on dates who's a widower, but he's 70. He's watching a lot of TV. There are a lot of people in their 70s and 80s who are watching TV. They don't get to see themselves. They see themselves as like a sidekick or just a grandparent. So there are other versions of marginalized people that my goal is to make sure that we, that we get to see. And also Dana, I've cast a lot of PBS digital, only like the YouTube stuff. I don't know if you know Origins of Everything. No. Okay. There's this amazing show on PBS Digital that's called Origins of Everything. And every episode is just like a 10-minute episode of literally the origin of everything. And something like that, I cast the host for. Her name is Danielle Bainbridge. Oh, she's like this. Oh, you do know her? She is just this brilliant.
I'm familiar with her. Yeah.
Yeah. She's amazing. I'm a huge fan. And I found her and I cast her. And something like that, sometimes this is going to sound a little wonky, but when PBS contacted us to cast, it's like anyone who's contacting my company, they know what I do. They know my job is to find a professor of history and sociology. I am not going to bring you what we've already seen. We've been seeing it for 50 years. I don't need to see it anymore. So that's my point, is that it's evolved in this way that now the people that are hiring me know I'm going to bring them a new perspective.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
No, that's it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for
But it's great. It's a good thing.
Oh, yes. I love what you do. Thank you. So I want to talk about our next question, which actually is very related to what we were just talking about. Media representation. So I want to go to you, Isaiah, to ask you this question. So we talked about, on-screen representation and how when you hear the word representation, people typically think of on-screen representation, but, we have to ask ourselves about off-screen representation. Who is in the director's roles? Who are the producers? So my specific question for you, what have you historically seen in your industry, or even in your particular jobs that you've had along the way? What have you seen when it comes to representation, and how do you want to change it?
Sorry about that. It's a really great question. I think as time has gone, I start to recognize things as I get further and further away from my entry-level jobs. Like when you go into an entry-level job, all you're looking for is an opportunity. That's all you want is opportunity. So you don't really think much about where you're at. You're just trying to figure out what you're doing, right? As I've gotten older into different stages of my career, when I look back on my entry-level jobs, I start to see a different picture. And what I recognize is there was entry-level jobs, and then there was other entry-level jobs that might be a step above. I was in what was called a tape vault for Fox Sports at the time. And, it was an entry-level job. All you did was run around tapes to producers. This is before files and all that kind of stuff like that. But then what I realized is everyone that was coming into that role was similar to me. And for some reason, there were other races who could get those entry-level jobs going into these production assistant roles or going into executive assistant roles. And you kind of look around, you're like, man, a lot of people look like me in this specific role. So I realized kind of early on that it mattered in a way. It mattered, like you realize, like, wait a second, like I'm not necessarily getting the same opportunities out the gate as other people are getting. But at that time, my mind was still focused on, man, you can't worry about that. You just have to rise above all that kind of stuff, right? So when you talk about behind the scenes, I was in a creative role for the majority of my career. I was, in producing and things like that before. And there was a show called Empire that was coming on. And one of the statements I made was, I said, you got a show that's about a hip hop family. And I'm looking around and I don't see a lot of diversity in who's going to tell the story about this hip hop family. So what I simply said, in things that I talked to other people about, as I'm part of a team now in management who we get to do the hiring for editors and audio mixers and graphic artists. And I said, sometimes when you look on paper, a lot of people are like, oh, well, the experience. But I'm like, but what are you missing? That might tell the bigger story. because there might be something we need to tell later on that if I don't have the right person who can tell that story, you can't reach the audience it's intended to get to in the first place. So when you talk about behind the scenes, if I walked you around the studio a lot back in the 2000s, the early 2000s, mid 2000s, in all honesty, there's a lot of diversity. But when you start looking behind that and you say, where are the jobs going? And you start looking at the executive level, there wasn't a whole lot in the management range of people of color. Take that next step into the executive directors, into the vice presidents, into the senior vice presidents. That's where you realize, where was the representation for people? And it's horrible that it took last year, but there was some real recognition. It's like that was one of the worst scenarios that you would never ask for a George Floyd incident to happen. And it's really unfortunate, but that really got some people open their eyes to say, wait a second, like, we really aren't what we think we are. And I think we as a university can look back to the summer, and a lot of people in the media I saw asking, Iowa media asking, how did I not understand what was going on? How did I not understand and see some things that might have been happening? And then you have to ask yourself, well, if you look at the Iowa media, is the Iowa media diverse that's going to be able to understand and be able to present to audiences different points of views? But that's not where we are. So right now is one of the most best opportunities, I think, for people of color, because there was a true recognition that they understand, like, it hasn't been there. And I believe that they, for however long it's going to go on, that there's a true, that they truly are trying to change what that representation is. So in my role right now, it's really fascinating to have that opportunity to recruit types of people, and for all kinds of different jobs, and as I'm working with whoever it is, internship levels, entry level jobs, whatever it is, you think about those things. It's like, sometimes it's the opportunity. One of the biggest things that frustrates me a lot is when I hear people talk about they put diversity and they match it up with talent. And they think, well, if I'm putting in diversity, that means I must be suffering on the talent side. And that's always been frustrating, that you assume that if you bring in people of color or diversity, that means you're giving something up. And I'm like, no, actually what diversity inclusion is truly about is making sure there's representation, but the representation of talent is everywhere. You can find those talented artists in entertainment all over the place. They're in Iowa City. You don't know them, but they're in Iowa City. No different. They're in Boston. Historical Black colleges, they're all around. It just really came down to who got the opportunities. And I put so much effort and energy to get back to these students here, a lot similar to what Ryan was talking about. I know people who will never, ever see the things that I've seen in my career and never have the chance to be around the people I've been around. So I'm a representation for them in the same way. So when I come back to these Iowa City classes, I know what it meant to be the Iowa City kid who got one break, one opportunity, and I'm gonna be that for somebody else. So it's never about just coming up yourself. It should be about bringing the next generation up with you. And I know Iowa's an often forgotten place. So I spend my time back in Iowa to make sure somebody else does have that next opportunity to go, or either just has the idea that, oh, this is something for me too,
Yeah, thank you, Isaiah. I mean, we very much appreciate that, especially because I think it's very important as we're having all these discussions about, diversity, equity, inclusion in the media industry. I think it's also important to realize that, like, we can share space, and it doesn't mean that we're taking away from what we already have, but it's also creating and fostering this space into where we can all progress together. And I know, Ryan, we haven't talked to you in a bit. This is actually pretty salient for you. I know in our discussion, you talked about how we have the responsibility as people within media to share the culture the way the culture wants to be shared, and the way that you particularly want it to be shared too. And so I would love you to speak to, like, your work within media representation, and how you've sort of embedded that into your role. And I'm also curious, if you have the time as well, to answer the question of, like, if you found actually an economic advantage to diversifying the people that you work with.
Yeah, I'll answer the second one first. It's proven that it's a economic advantage to have diverse stories. We're seeing it now, right? We at Cashmere have the opportunity and the fortune to work on a lot of content and connect that content to specific audiences that is very popular content. We work on Atlanta on FX. We worked on Black Panther. We worked on Get Out. We worked on Us. We work on Rhythm and Flow on Netflix. We worked on Jingle Jangle Soul, right, which just won an Oscar. Those movies are all critically acclaimed, right? Movies and TV shows, but more so, they're very, very popular, right? We work on Blackish and Grownish and Mixedish. These are very popular shows because they're talking about experiences where we can all see ourselves through, right? Whether those are experiences of young Black people, whether they're experiences of, people within a certain industry, hip hop industry, whether they're experiences that happened a long time ago or experiences that are happening now, whether they're fictional or nonfiction, we can all see ourselves through it, right? So it's funny because this happens all the time. And I'm old enough now that I remember like when I was younger and all of a sudden there was a bunch of hood movies, like Boys in the Hood, Menace to Society, New Jack City, all that. And they were like, oh my God, this is amazing that Black people can tell stories, you know what I mean? And then it like disappears and then it comes back again. We worked on Straight Outta Compton. And it's like, oh, this is the surprise hit of the year. I'm like, how the hell is that a surprise? I've been waiting to see that movie since I was in 6th grade, right? So it's like, is there economic advantage to selling headphones, Beats headphones to people of color, putting them in hip hop music videos? Yes, and it continues to happen. Look at what's driving YouTube. Look at the content that's driving YouTube. Look at the top rated music on Apple Music or Spotify, right? It just continues to baffle me how other people are so baffled by this, right? And some of the reason that they are, what I've seen in the entertainment industry, is because they're not comfortable with it, right? There was this this adage for years that, and it's still there even to this day, in movies, is like, oh, Black leads it don't work well overseas, right? But yet Black Panther is what, the 5th biggest movie of all time, right? It's just, I never want to underestimate the ability of mainstream to use our success, and by our I mean Black, people of color, Latino, LGBTQIA plus, Asian, as an anomaly, right? Oh yeah, Black Panther worked, but that's just because it's part of the Marvel thing and there's this other thing going on. Oh yeah, Get Out worked, but that's just because Jordan Peele did it. No, these aren't anomalies. These continue to happen over and over again. So yeah, there's an economic advantage to presenting these stories, because sometimes these stories are global in their very perspective, like Black Panther and the success it had in places like Saudi Arabia, where they don't even show American movies, right? But showed that, right? These stories travel. And that is really our power as a culture and as a nation, is our ability to see similarities in different stories, right? And how we can see ourselves in the stories of other people. I was talking to some of my colleagues yesterday. They're Latina, or she was a Latina, and she was talking about how when Fresh Off the Boat came on, like she would watch that with her family, because even though Fresh Off the Boat was about the Asian American experience, it's about the immigrant experience, right? So those types of shows, as proven, do well. Those types of movies do well. And I think that the responsibility that you're talking about is, if we're going to show the culture. See, I grew up in a time that it was a little unique, because sometimes you saw the culture, but it wasn't represented like it should have been, right? The culture that I've seen in this Sprite commercial, Sprite's a bad example because they already did a good job. This culture I'm seeing in like this Doritos commercial, that don't look like Yo MTV Raps. That ain't the same shit. You know what I'm saying? But that's all we had. So it was like, okay, well, cool. At least we're getting some attention. You know what I mean? So it was always important to me to not only document when I was a journalist, to document it for years ahead, right? So I remember I had this project that I did where they said, and when I was in college, look at the same news event and how it's covered in 2 different things, right? And I looked at I think it's the 72 Olympics with holding up the Black fist, right, in Mexico City. And I learned so much about that event. And I looked at how it was told in Sports Illustrated versus how it was told in Ebony magazine, right? This is obviously years after it took place. And Sports Illustrated was this big, right? And a little column in the front of the book. On Ebony magazine, it was the cover, right? So it's amazing to see, like, years later, if you look back on this amazing, one of the most memorable sporting events of all time, and you look in the #1 sporting publication of all time, and you're like, oh, I guess it wasn't that big of a deal, right? So when I was working at the Source magazine, when I work on content that comes from culture, I have to make it a big deal. I just pulled this out the closet the other day, because that's a cover of DMX. And I probably did it 15 years ago, right, for the Source magazine where I used to work. That means more now than it arguably than it did back then, right? So it's important for, like, to understand the impact that DMX had, the impact that those Olympians had. Where can we go and find that 10, 20, 50, 100 years later, right? So that's important to us, right? When we look at the movies and films that I'm talking about now, how they're being marketed, the impact that they had, how they're being covered. Like, if we look back in this, to know where you're going, you got to know where you've been, right? So as we look back at this, everything that I'm doing, I'm trying to do from a historical standpoint too. There's an archive of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ryan. And I'm particularly struck by this, like, investment in the community and the culture, and being very representative of that. And that kind of reminds me, I'm going to shift over to Dana. That reminds me of a discussion that we had, especially about making sure that we're investing within the communities that we're reporting on. I know we talked about, parachute journalism. And so if you can speak a little bit about during your career, what you've done to ensure that media representation is as fair, as accurate as it can be. And before you answer, I also want to remind the audience to please send through any questions that you might have into the Q&A function, so we can get to them at the end.
Yeah, and I'll just say, just following up, on sort of what Ryan was saying and Isaiah, another thing that sort of has happened is, like, one of my favorite programs to watch is Queen Sugar, right? And these are women and women of color who are telling stories about people of color, and the way that they are portrayed on the screen is so beautiful. It's like, when you are a person of color and you're going out to tell someone else's story that's sort of representative of what you're familiar with, you pay attention. You pay attention to what they look like. You pay attention to what they sound like. You want them to be as authentic as they can possibly be. You're not parachuting in, and sort of saying, I'm just here to tell your story. Let me hear what you have to say, and I'm out of here. And then we just did a thing this past weekend where the Library of Congress is reaching out to people to try to get them to tell the stories of, like, former slaves. And one of the things that they talk about at the Library of Congress is how the people who, there are these sort of audio recordings that are interpreted by the white reporters that went to get their stories. And so they're sort of saying, the Librarian of Congress, who is an African-American woman, Carla Hayden, basically said, you can almost hear in the way that they're telling their stories that they're using their own voices to interpret what they think Black people should have sounded like back then, right? And so for me, it's super important to be very aware, when I'm going someplace. It's not, I want to give them the power to tell their authentic story. I want to be able to photograph them or, portray them. I hate to say portray them, that sounds weird, but let them tell, show us who they are, right? To sort of pay attention when I'm watching Queen Sugar, like, wow, that camera angle, like, is really playing up how beautiful this brown skin is, like, where, there are a lot of other cinematographers prior to when people got woke, kind of, right? That, they wore, like, pancake makeup. They made them do things that that wasn't natural. And so for me as a journalist, obviously always trying to get to people's truth, for sure, but also just not to buy into what I think people think these people should be saying. Let them say what they want to say. I think Ryan, maybe you were talking about a photography or something, and I remember quite a few photographers. I teach, I'm an adjunct also in journalism, and we have sort of a photo session, and several photographers have really sort of touted this woman's photography, and she's a beautiful photographer, but she photographs sort of children. She did a series of sort of about people in poverty, and they sort of talked about how real it was, you know, and like, look at this and this beauty. And there's this one photo that came up like 3 times, and it's of this like little boy, and they're saying, oh, look how real this is. And they're clearly in sort of a situation where it's, you know, maybe a shelter or something, but there's this little boy, and he's got these 2 little toy water guns, and he's standing on this table, and he's got these water guns, and they're like, look at that, look at that photo. And I was like, that's a white boy, right? He's a cute white boy with these guns. I said, but if you were to flip that photograph and make that a Black family, would we be having this conversation about how great a photograph this is right now? It would be buying into this entirely different stereotype, right? And so I just try to keep in mind, and I try to talk with my team all the time about, let's just really think about when we're telling people stories, you know, are we telling them in a way that, you know, is not going to sort of stereotype them? You know, are we telling them in a way, are we being honest about what their intentions are, you know, and what they're trying to say, and not trying to sort of turn it into what we think the narrative of what our listeners want to hear. And that's really hard sometimes. I mean, I get dinged for it too, trust me. I do all the time, but you know, it's part of the work that I try to do.
Thank you so much, Dana. We appreciate that response. So before we get to our audience questions, I just wanted to ask one last question. If everyone could give maybe a 30-second response to it, if you can. You know, how did the University of Iowa prepare you?
And we can start with Isaiah.
Yeah, Isaiah, sorry, you can go first.
Sorry about that. I'm always going to credit Dr. Talbot. I know he's not there no more, because I tried to go find him one time on a visit, but Dr. Talbot was one of my English writers, professors, and he called me out. And he was like, Isaiah, you're a good writer, but you don't put enough effort into your writing. And he's right, because in college, I used to write my stuff the night before and then put it in. And like, he was like, man, if you just apply yourself, he's like, you could turn yourself into a really great writer. And when I got into the promo gig, that's where I started turning to writing more and getting the chance to actually write the promo scripts. And you learn nothing's good enough. Like, you have to do, you think you might turn in the best, you know, script ever, and not, they send that back to you. So I learned that repetition that Professor Talbot was talking about was like my preparation for like real life when you get into this, because it's not the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth. It's like the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th that you revise on your scripts that finally makes it. So he taught me that I needed to truly like apply myself, but it was like a shot to the face, and it was a nice wake-up call for me that I needed.
Yeah, thank you, Isaiah, especially for sharing that anecdote. And I know, Ryan, you talked a lot about the fundamentals that Iowa gave you, and so I'd love to hear you speak about that really quickly.
Yeah, I think, you know, I would say the same thing is somewhat like Isaiah said. It's like the fundamentals. Like, at the end of the day, everything that we're doing, especially now in a remote environment, you gotta be able to write. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you gotta be able to convey this idea through an email or through some kind of presentation deck or something like that, right? Because you're not always going to be able to even meet up in person. I would definitely prepared me with the fundamentals of that. The other person, since Isaiah's given shout out, I gave a shout out to Dr. Berry earlier, and I'll do that again, because she, at some point in my career at Iowa, I had an independent study. I think that's what's going on. I'm going to do it with Dr. Berry, right? And I'm going to just chill. Right. And she was like, no, you have to make this. I didn't know Dr. Berry that well, I guess. Right. Because she was like, you need to make the website for the National Association of Black Journalists Iowa chapter. And I was like, cool. How do you do that? Right. This is, you know, I don't know, 99 or something. It wasn't you had to really make a website from scratch. Like you want to know WordPress or anything like that. So she hooked me up with somebody in the computer science department. I went over there. I can't remember his name, but he was like, yo, if you know how to do digital stuff, if you know how to make websites, your career path is going to be enhanced. You're going to make more money. You're going to do all this stuff. And I was like, okay, cool. And I was able to go to the bookstore and buy Photoshop and Dreamweaver and just learn how to do it, right? And I built the website, very rudimentary. If you guys saw it now, you'd probably laugh your ass off. But at the time, it's pretty impressive, at least for me, right? But,
Yep.
you know, I went on to then not only be a journalist, but work in digital marketing, social media marketing, like Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, creating digital content. That's the 90% of what I do, right? And it's amazing because those fundamentals are there. Even now when I meet with like my designers or something, they're like, yeah, you can't do that. I'm like, yeah, you can. Hold on, move out the way. Let me show you this a little bit, right? Like it's just to have the fundamentals to have that conversation. And I got those fundamentals that would be considered pretty advanced and sophisticated at the University of Iowa 20 years ago. You know what I mean? So it's important. And now when you look back on my path and you're like, hey, I was focused on this. I was a DJ on the radio station. I was utilizing, some of the nightclubs there at University of Iowa to meet, hip hop artists and stuff. And I was learning how to write and I was learning how to do digital stuff. And then you look at my career now and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So, but it was all right there in Iowa City where it was coming together.
Yeah, it's all about the fundamentals. So I really appreciate that, Ryan. And I'm going to ask both Dana first and then Risa, please, I'm so sorry, but please let us know how Iowa has impacted your career and what it has taught you in briefest amount of time possible, just so we can get to some Q&A answers from the audience. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll reiterate fundamentals, the ability. I think Iowa was really sort of liberating and that you could kind of do whatever they let you go for it. I never felt constrained, really. I mean, I think, I had some great professors. I had a couple of African-American professors. Actually, one was African, Joe Ascroft was at the university. He was at the journalism school. He had traveled internationally and had done all this phenomenal international reporting that he just sort of let me know I could do this. There were no limits. And I felt like Iowa overall, I was at KRUI. I had a very failed attempt at a sort of pseudo DJ co-hosting thing, but it was fun. But I just felt like there was always that support system there to back you up and not to really hold you back where, and having experienced as a teacher or adjunct now, some of the limitations that some universities have on students, some of the competitive nature that exists in certain institutions. Iowa was just not like that. And I just felt like it was an opportunity to really pursue whatever I wanted to pursue.
Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Risa before we open it up to Q&A.
I will speed through this one. I learned my lesson. Two professors I'm going to shout out, neither are there, Stephen Foster and Hans Brader. Hans Brader created the intermediate arts program there, totally changed my life. I grew up in Jersey, 30 minutes right outside of Manhattan, and I grew up with a lot of braggarts, and it was all attitude. It was whatever. It's the culture I came from. And Iowa was the exact opposite. And it was such a blessing in my life. It was about humility. It was about hard work and kindness. And I needed that. And I was unaware that I needed that. And thank God that I went in unaware because I got my butt kicked for it. And it was extremely helpful. Additionally, and the last thing I'll say is, as someone who came out while I was in Iowa, what a blessing, because I cannot imagine being a young queer kid who was 21 in Manhattan and figuring that out here in a really big world with way too many people and way too much personality and way too many bars. I had a huge support system in Iowa at the university, social workers and, PhDs who were getting their people who were getting their PhDs in therapy. I mean, I had a huge support system, and that space is what saved me. So I will forever be grateful.
Thank you, Risa. I really, really appreciate that answer. And we have 2 comments. It's actually 6:30 now, so hopefully we can keep you all for like a couple more minutes. But we have a comment from Kembrew, and they've said, as the chair of communication studies, he wanted to thank you, all the panelists, for being here. And then that final question that we have is actually from Dr. Berry, Dr. Venice Berry, and it's for Risa. And she asked, did you work on Flava Flav?
I did not.
Ah.
I did not. No, that was a tough one, but I did not. I felt like there was going to be something better out there that I could feel good about. That one wasn't it. And thank God for it, because there was not a lot out there at the time. So everything counts. But that was not where I wanted to put my allyship. Nope.
Thanks, Risa.
Well, thank you all for being here this evening. Thank you to our audience for listening. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Dr. Rife. Thank you, Nick. This session was recorded, so it'll be available at a later time, and there'll be information about that. So thank you, and everybody have a good evening, afternoon, depending on where you are.
Yeah, we could literally talk for hours, I'm sure, as all the panelists can agree. But I wanted to just also extend my gratitude and say thank you to everyone who gave us an hour of your time, a little bit more. And thanks to the audience for being here and listening to these iconic panelists.
Thanks for having us. It was fun.
Yeah,
My pleasure.
Yeah, I thought it was much longer, but thank you so much. Also, if that's Kembrew McLeod, then I definitely had beers with you a very long time ago. So thanks so much for inviting me. Thank you, all of you.